In part 2 of this talk, Socrates and the Laws, I want to focus in on the details of the apparent contradiction between something said in the Crito, and which Socrates appears to agree with, and something he says in his defense speech as represented by Plato in the Apology. In the Apology, Socrates says that even if the city was to command it, he would not give up philosophizing. But in the Crito, he seems to agree with the speech of the Personified Laws of Athens that every citizen ought to obey the laws unconditionally. This gives us an apparent contradiction. Signaling that one is prepared to disobey a law or lawful command is not consistent with the claim that all laws and lawful commands ought to be obeyed. However, it remains to be seen whether there really is a contradiction here. We'll look at the Crito first. The Crito is an odd kind of a dialogue in that it does not apparently follow the usual Socratic formula of elenkos followed by aporia. See parts 2 and 3 of my Socratic Method series. The dramatic setting is shortly after his trial, and the location is the cell in which Socrates is being held in the short period before his pending execution. It's a short enough dialogue, and if anybody wants to read it, I've put a link down in the description to a text of the translation, which is online, and also I have recorded the speech of the Personified Laws of Athens, which I'm uploading simultaneously with this talk. His old and dear friend Crito has come to tell Socrates that an escape plan has been formulated, guards can be easily bribed, and that Socrates can seek asylum abroad. And Crito even mentions Thessaly as a possible destination in which he has some influence. Socrates can escape and settle in Thessaly, or perhaps somewhere else if he prefers. Socrates' response to this plan is entirely negative. But now Socrates has to present Crito with a persuasive argument as to why he cannot take up this plan. He must do so in a way that will satisfy Crito, that will bring him to understand why they cannot actualize this plan. What follows is a peculiar kind of argument that aims at persuading Crito that his plan is wrong-headed. Now, there are two main segments in this short dialogue: the initial discussion in which Crito explains the escape plan to Socrates, and a speech attributed to the Personified Laws of Athens. In the first part, Crito presents the escape plan. In this he cites two motives: his deep personal affection for Socrates, but also his fears about what people will think. Quote, "If you die, it is not just a single misfortune for me. No, quite apart from being deprived of a friend, the like of whom I shall never find again, many people who do not know you and me at all well will think that I was able to save you if I was willing to spend my money, but I did not care. And what reputation could be more disgraceful than this? A reputation for setting higher value on money than on friends. For most people won't believe that, although you were willing to help, you yourself were not willing to quit this place." End quote. Socrates picks up on this second motive and gently admonishes Crito for having concern for what the many think. Only the views of the best should be of concern. Crito replies, quote, "Socrates, surely you can see that it is indeed necessary to care about popular opinion. The very situation we are now in demonstrates that, if someone is discredited in their eyes, the multitude can do harm." End quote. Crito is clearly alluding to the fact that popular opinion has condemned Socrates to death in the form of a majority verdict in a trial. Now, in reaction to all this, Socrates elicits agreement from Crito for the following statements. Should we follow the opinion of the majority and fear it, or the opinion of one person if there is someone who is knowledgeable and feels more shame and fear before him than before all the others put together? In other words, should we be concerned about the views of the many, or should we just be concerned about the views of the wise? We should not attach importance to living, but to living well. To live well is to live nobly and justly. So the question then is this plan noble and just? He also agrees to the following: we should never act unjustly. We should never return an injustice if we are treated unjustly, as most people think. If we suffer harm, it is not just to do harm in return, as most people assert. Doing harm to people is no different from acting unjustly. We should neither return an injustice, nor do harm to any man, regardless of what we suffer at his hands. And a person should do whatever he agrees with someone to do, provided it is just. Having received Crito's agreement to these statements, Socrates then raises this question, quote, "In leaving this place, without having convinced the city, are we doing harm even to those we should harm least of all? Or are we not doing harm, and are we abiding by our agreements, since they are just?" End quote. There follows a lengthy speech by the Personified Laws of Athens. The gist of the speech is that unconditional obedience to the laws is a duty falling on every citizen. This includes not only the statutes of the city, but the verdicts of court, and any executive commands given by lawful authorities. In this case, following Crito's proposed course of action would, quote, "destroy us, the laws, and the entire city," end quote. The city cannot exist if its laws have no force. Judgments once delivered stand supreme. The speech also claims that we bring you to birth, since through us your father married your mother and begot you. The authority of the city is akin to that of parents, but more so because they too are citizens of the city and owe the same obedience. Your homeland is more worthy of respect than your mother or father, or all of your other ancestors, and is more august and sacred, and more exalted in status in the eyes of the gods and of men of intelligence. Even if the verdict of the court is unjust, it is binding, for if not, then every convicted person could in principle flout it. The verdict may be unjust, but it is still the lawful verdict of the court, and Socrates has a duty to submit to the sentence. The content of the judgment may be flawed, unjust even, but the judgment itself, insofar as it is lawfully arrived at and is final, is binding. The laws even address this point. If you depart this world, you depart unjustly treated by your fellow men, and not by us, the laws. So the dialogue ends shortly after this speech, with Crito giving his agreement to its content, and so the escape plan will be permanently shelved. In summary, the main point of the laws are three. Disobedience to law harms everyone and the polity itself. The relationship between citizen and state parallels that between child and parent, and there is an implicit and assumed agreement by the citizen to obey the laws and obey them unconditionally. This latter point is the earliest known appearance of what we now call social contract theory. Now, whether Plato as the writer, and let alone Socrates as the speaker, actually endorses this theory is a question that I would like to bracket off for the moment. But now, returning to the Apology. Socrates makes explicit something that would have been on the mind of the many jurors and others involved, that is to say, an undertaking by Socrates to abstain from philosophizing would be a satisfactory outcome for most of the court. It would solve the problem of Socrates' allegedly subversive activities and satisfy most of those ill-disposed towards him. Quote, and this is Socrates speaking, hypothetically, "Socrates, on this occasion we shall not heed Anytus. Instead, we shall let you go, but on this condition, that you no longer spend your time in this inquiry, nor engage in philosophy, and should you ever be caught doing so again, you shall die." End quote. With this, Socrates anticipates what must have been on the mind of many in the court that day, but he brings this up only to then close the door on this possible solution. He says, quote, "Men of Athens, I embrace you and I love you, but I shall heed the god rather than you, and as long as I am alive and able to do so, I shall not cease engaging in philosophy, exhorting you, and pointing out to any of you whom I ever meet, saying in my usual manner, 'Best of men, you are Athenians, citizens of the greatest city, most renowned for her wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed that you care about piling up as much money, reputation, and honor as you can, while giving no care or thought to wisdom and truth, and how your soul may be as good as it can be?'" End quote. Faced with the choice, Socrates will obey the commands of God over those of Athens, because to do otherwise would be itself an act of gross impiety. The irony here, impossible to ignore, is that he is being charged with impiety. Socrates again reminds the court that his mission is divinely appointed, as revealed in his own interpretation of the Delphic oracle sought by his friend and admirer Chaerephon. Philosophy is the care of the soul, especially demanded in his particular social context in which most people were consumed by the pursuit of material goods and gave little or any heed to their moral or what you might call spiritual welfare. Socrates is addressing a late 5th century BC Athenian audience, but his question could be equally posed to an early 21st century Western consumer society audience. Are you not ashamed that you care about piling up as much money, reputation, and honor as you can, while giving no care or thought to wisdom and truth, and how your soul may be as good as it can be? A question as challenging to us now as it was to Socrates' original audience back in 399 BC. And so, Socratic philosophy is far from being of purely historical interest. If it were only that, we ought not bother with it. Rather, we would consign it to the care of classical scholars, to something like an intellectual museum. When Socrates talks about philosophy as care of the soul, we should not overburden this word soul with any presuppositions from a later time. The Greek word here is psyche, from which we derive our modern words like psyche and psychology, and simply means something like the principle of life, itself combined, in the case of humans, with what we call the mind, or consciousness, or intellect. As a very rough approximation, we would not be going too far wrong to think of the soul, psyche, as that thing which differentiates a living being from a corpse, or, to turn it around, a corpse is a body no longer animated by a soul. So something like the principle of life. Things like stone are not dead because they are not of their nature living beings. Only living beings can die, and indeed all living beings are subject to death. However, unlike plants and other animals, man seems to be the only living being for which its own being is a question unto itself. Philosophy is that self-interrogating mode whereby we become a question unto ourselves, an object of self-investigation. This may be rooted in the uniquely human predicament that we can foresee our own inevitable death. It accompanies us, even if this is for the most part at the back of our minds, except perhaps in times of great danger like war, illness, or old age, when it comes to the foreground and its presence may even come to dominate our intentions. In this passage, Socrates is saying, in effect, that philosophy is the means by which man investigates himself in order to realize himself, and under both senses, namely, to become fully oneself as well as to intellectually grasp oneself through our powers of understanding. Socrates holds that the former comes through the latter, that is, we can become fully ourselves, become fully realized through the practice of philosophy. And this, I take it, is what he means by care of the soul. At the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, there were sacred slogans inscribed, and chief among these was the phrase "genothesiauton." Grammatically, this takes the imperative form, thus it is a command, and it means know thyself. While this sacred slogan does not become an explicit theme in the Apology, its force is pervasive throughout that text. The spirit of Delphi hovers over the whole text, initially invoked through the recounting of the story of Chaerephon's question about Socrates, which he put to the Delphic oracle: is anyone wiser than Socrates? Socrates' own insistence that his philosophical activities are divinely commanded has its foundations in the Delphic imperative, know thyself. The passage that forms the first part of the apparent contradiction is Socrates' refusal to stop philosophizing if he were ordered to do so by the authorities of the city. The second part is Socrates' unequivocal agreement with the speech of the Personified Laws of Athens, that laws are unconditionally binding. The only recourse is to use persuasion where there is a perceived error or injustice, which is precisely what he does in his defense speech in the Apology. As he was found guilty of the charges, his efforts at persuasion clearly failed. But as a matter of interest, Athenian juries at this time numbered 501, and we know how they voted in this case. 280 guilty, 221 not guilty. It seems that a considerable number of jurors did not perceive Socratic philosophizing as a threat. This is interesting. Now, why should we conclude that the contradiction here is only apparent and not real? I'll begin by quoting M. Dyson's 1978 article from the Classical Quarterly, The Structure of the Laws speech in Plato's Crito. He says, quote, "In short, the proposition that obligation to the state overrides the claims of personal advantage or of obligations to friends and family is not inconsistent with the proposition that obligation to the god overrides obligation to the state." End quote. Dyson is certainly correct to point out that, in general, divine commands must always take precedence over human statute, if there is ever a conflict between the two. The only way around this principle is either A, to deny the existence of the gods altogether, or B, deny that the gods take any interest in human affairs. To the first, professed atheism was not a position that could be publicly uttered in ancient Athens without serious negative consequences, for atheism was considered to be a form of treason. But option B, divine disinterest, was the actual position of the philosopher Epicurus and his followers. Many commentators back then and now take this to be a covert expression of atheism, for if it were true that the gods care nothing for human affairs, then for us they might as well not exist. While Socrates is most certainly not an atheist, there are very good textual reasons in Plato that lead us to believe that he did not agree with the popular conception of the gods, of piety, or of public cultic practices. The key to understanding Socratic piety is, again, located in a proper understanding of the Delphic imperative, know thyself, and the path he took to realize it, namely the practice of philosophy, and philosophy as the care of the soul, or care of the self if you prefer. Now, interestingly, as a side note, the name of the chief prosecutor in the historical trial, and as named in the Apology, was Meletus. Now, the verb to care in Greek is melatino, and his name means something like care, caring one, something like that. But there is also a pun here, as his name, Meletus, is very close to another similar sounding word, which meant blockhead or meddler. This is truly remarkable, for the trial of Socrates could also be understood as a dispute over care. Who really cares for the city, or what does care for the city really involve? Socrates asserts that he is the only one who truly cares about the city because he alone is dedicated to urging his fellow citizens to care primarily about their souls rather than their material goods, and that as he is uniquely concerned with the good of the whole rather than only parts of it, namely sectional interests, he is the only true statesman in Athens, for the business of the statesman is the good of the whole, or the common good. Whereas, by implication, Meletus seems to claim that true care somehow consists of complying with convention and the status quo. He explicitly states that what Socrates is doing is harmful, and not only that, but that Socrates is unique in that he is the only one in Athens who is causing harm to the young people of the city. Implicit in this is the undeniable claim that philosophy is harmful. Now, in the quote earlier above, Dyson mentions this principle that obligation to the god overrides obligation to the state. This opens up a number of issues which are of the highest importance for political philosophy. For instance, what is the origin of law? What obligations do we have towards laws? What are the limits, if any, in the making of human statutes? If we affirm the divine, we also affirm the possibility of divine commands. And what happens if and when human commands conflict with divine commands? So the question about the origin of law does not so much refer to its historical origins, but rather to its ontological origin. Ontology being that part of philosophy which deals with the being of things. In other words, what are and where do laws come from? Do they originate in the will of the lawmakers, or do they have a deeper foundation, for instance, in God or reason itself? Do they have some kind of extramental and substantial existence? And if not, what then is their mode of existence? What obligations do we have towards the laws, or more properly speaking, towards positive law, that is, laws made by human lawmakers? What limits are there to what can be made into law? For instance, would a law ordering the abolition of all private property be binding, or a law forbidding the worship of God, or a law that reclassifies whole sections of the population as chattel slaves of a ruling elite? I know these are extreme examples, but I choose them precisely because they bring out in stark relief what is at stake here. Assuming that we affirm the divine, that is to say, the existence of God or gods, we also affirm the possibility that God commands certain things to be prohibited and others to be done. For instance, with the 10 Commandments handed to Moses, which prohibit certain acts and command the performance of others. What is the situation if and when human statutes and commands conflict with divine commands? This last scenario is one of the implications from the trial of Socrates. If we grant his claim that he is indeed commanded by the god to practice philosophy, but the city of Athens has condemned him for doing just that, and if, as some sort of plea deal, he would be released if he agreed to stop philosophizing, if we understand this refusal on the part of Socrates to take such a deal, if indeed it were offered, his refusal must be understood as grounded in his absolute conviction that philosophizing is an activity that has been commanded by the god. Once we come to appreciate how divine commands trump human commands, we can begin to see how the apparent contradiction between the Crito and the Apology is only apparent. It's not a real contradiction. That is to say that the commands of God always trump those of man if there is a dispute. And it's almost impossible to imagine anybody in that court who would deny that. But how does Socrates justify his claim that his philosophizing is divinely commanded? Now, in general terms, beyond the historically specific incident of Socrates' trial and condemnation, how and why is philosophizing itself outside the jurisdiction of any human authority? These last two questions will be the topic of the next and last in this series, Socrates and the Laws. Once again, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and press the notification bell if you want to be notified about new uploads. But for now, thank you for your attention.